Many thanks to Jerb, Jaren, DayZ Podcast, Taggy's Tag West, Great Poncho and Black Knight for making this video possible. DayZ patch 1.15 has brought about changes to the rate that weapons can fire at, giving some weapons insane levels of damage output. So in this video we're going to be reviewing the 23 weapons that have had RPM stat changes and unravel the mystery of why 17 of these weapons didn't actually get any RPM buff. To get everybody on the same page, RPM is the rate a weapon can fire per minute without considering reloads or rounds per minute. In patch 1.15 there were 23 weapons that had their RPM stats changed, and across these 23 weapons, in total 37 fire modes were impacted by the RPM changes, but not all of them have actually changed. In fact, only 6 of these 23 weapons have seen any change in the game, encompassing 8 fire modes of the potential 37. The reason for this is how RPM works in DayZ. The speed at which our character's actions speak to a server we're on in DayZ is once every 0.033 seconds, which means rates of fire in DayZ can only fire at a maximum of once every 0.033 seconds and must be a multiple of this 0.033 value. To simplify this, between 0 and 0.033 seconds translates to 1800 RPM in DayZ, where between 0.034 and 0.066 is 900 RPM, and between 0.067 and 0.099 is 600 RPM. This means on a full auto weapon you cannot have 500 RPM, 700 RPM, 200 RPM, or 1200 RPM. You can only have 1800, 900, 600, etc. This is the reason why so many full auto weapons in DayZ are 600 RPM. So while these 23 weapons had their RPM values changed across 37 fire modes, only 6 of the weapons, or a total of 8 fire modes, actually changed from one RPM group to another. This is probably why there's been some confusion within the community to which weapons have changed in RPM, such as the UMP. Many people believe that the UMP's rate of fire has changed, which hasn't changed. I did check the stats and the stats have changed, but not enough to upgrade it or downgrade it to a new RPM group, as shown here with a UMP on full auto comparison in 1.14 and 1.15. With all of that out of the way, we can finally get onto the juicy stuff in this video. The first of the 6 weapons to be upgraded into a new RPM group in 1.15 is the M16, which doesn't actually have a full auto fire mode. Burst fire is the fastest the M16 fires, which will vary in RPM as you have to continuously tap the fire button in these 3-shot bursts. On average in 1.14 that is 400 RPM during burst fires, and in 1.15 the burst fire rate is around 550 RPM. In the M16's case, this only really buffs it in close range, as beyond 50 meters makes burst fire patterns too hard to counter, but this is nonetheless a good buff. A weapon that got a significant buff, however, is the M4, which used to fire at 600 RPM in 1.14, now firing at 900 RPM, which is an insane buff that makes the M4 even more desirable. The next weapon to get jacked is a VSS and the ASVAL. I call these one weapon because in the game files they are one weapon, just with slightly modified stats between them. So for future reference, if one changes, the other one will probably change with it. Both of these weapons used to fire at 600 RPM like the M4 in 1.14, but now, like the M4, fires at 900 RPM and mag dumps 20 rounds in just 1.25 seconds. Similar to the VSS and the ASVAL, the Skorpion got a buff from 600 to 900 RPM too, mag dumping in 1.25 seconds again, but obviously not doing as much damage as the VSS and the ASVAL. However, due to this change, the Skorpion now outputs more damage per second than the UMP does, solely due to this RPM change. The Skorpion doesn't do more damage than the MP5 because the MP5 has gone from 600 RPM to 900 RPM too, and not only has it had its full auto fire mode RPM increased, but its burst fire mode RPM too. In burst fire mode, like the M16, the MP5 fires at 550 RPM now instead of 400 RPM like in 1.14, depending on how lucky or skilled the user is at tapping the fire button at the correct intervals. However, due to the MP5's lower recoil compared to the M16, it is much friendlier to players using burst fire mode. In full auto though, the MP5 will shred in close quarters, putting out the most health and shock damage of any SMG in the category now. The final weapon of the 6 to get an RPM buff is the VAIGA, receiving a buff on both of its fire modes, semi-auto and full auto. In semi-auto mode, the rate of fire used to be 200 RPM, but is now 300 RPM depending on how well you time your shots. This 300 RPM during semi-auto, funnily enough, is also the RPM that VAIGA had in 1.14, but for full auto, 300 RPM, but now has a monster buff of 50% up to 450 RPM on full auto that will melt any horde of infected that gets in your way. The VAIGA firing buttshot was very powerful in patch 1.14, but now with this 50% damage output increase, it will strike fear into your enemies as it shakes the ground from pumping out kilo after kilo of molten lead at them. This weapon is scary. But I digest, all 6 of these weapons have been buffed in 1.15 and will make using them feel night and day different. But where I didn't see a difference though is the other 17 weapons that had their RPM values changed, which I did test for 1.14 and 1.15, even going as far as syncing them up in Sony Vegas and seeing the visual differences if there were any, and I didn't see any. However, because I synced them up and have footage of them, I'm going to show you all 23 weapons totaling 37 fire modes that were changed in 1.15, so you can see for yourself if there is a difference and have a source of info of which weapons did and which weapons didn't get an RPM buff. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day.